Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be teaching Sunday morning, November the 17th. If you are an on-campus teacher teaching either adult or student small groups, then this video is designed to coach you through this week's lesson to help you get acquainted with it and prepared to teach it. So grab that teaching transcript. You should have it by now. Also, the attachment that came with it, there was a one-page attachment that came with it. So grab that transcript and that attachment, get something to write with. Plan on being with me here for the next 15 minutes or so because I'm going to walk you through this teaching transcript and hopefully help you get prepared to teach it this Sunday, all right? Get the transcript out. Let's look at it together. Page 1. This is your lesson overview. This isn't a page that you teach. This is just introducing you to the lesson. And you'll see that this week's lesson, it says that the primary point that you're teaching is this, that our good intentions matter very little if our actions aren't in keeping with those intentions. In other words, this lesson is about the fact that our actions matter, that what we do matter. And it doesn't matter so much, if somebody wants to have a good marriage, well, that's great. Are we doing the things that are going to lead to a good marriage? Or someone wants this specific outcome in their life, well, that's great that you want it and that's your intention, but are you doing the actions that are going to get you there? That's what this lesson is all about. That's going to be in keeping, and that's going to parallel the sermon from Sunday. So this lesson is going to go with the sermon, but this lesson is going to really get to the heart of the matter, all right? And that's what you're going to see there. That's what page 1 tells you about. Now, flip on over to page 2. Let's actually look at the lesson that you're going to be teaching. Let's get into this thing. On page 2, you're going to start off with an illustration, one that I absolutely love. This is the illustration of Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Emperor's New Clothes. You may already know this story, so you may be able to dive right in and just tell the story from your own memory. If you're not familiar with it, it's a great story. It's about an emperor who has some clothes made for him, some new clothes. But as the story goes, the clothes are made by a couple of swindlers. These swindlers show up to the palace there for the king and make him some new clothes, but they say that they have fabric that's magical. This magical fabric is so great that only people like you, king, can even see it. People who are worthy to see it. No one else can even see it. Well, the reality is they don't have anything. They're making him clothes, they're pretending. Well, as they make the emperor these new clothes that are supposedly made out of, magical fabric, the king's looking at it and he can't see anything. He can't see the clothes. Well, of course, he's thinking to himself, I'm supposed to be able to see it. So if I admit that I can't see this fabric, they're going to know that I'm not really even worthy to see it. So the king makes on like, oh yeah, this is fantastic. And of course, his top advisors are doing the same. All the while, there's no clothes to be seen. And the whole point of the story is that it's the king's pride that prevents him from admitting that he can't see the clothes. And it's his advisors' pride that prevent them from admitting that they can't see the clothes. And it's kind of funny that later on in the story, it's a little boy who exclaims, the emperor, he's not wearing anything at all. And the whole point is this, that it's because of the emperor's pride and those around him, it's because of their pride that they won't admit that they can't see the clothes. And as a result, their pride is eventually exposed, if you will. The emperor's literally exposed. But the point is, they wouldn't admit it. And because they wouldn't admit it, things went awry on them. And here's your transition statement. After you tell that story, which isn't that a fun story? After the transition, after the illustration there, you've got this transition statement on page 2. It says to say this, that we have just as much trouble admitting when we don't have it all together. Our pride creates in us a desire to appear to have everything under control when it's obvious that something needs to change. And here's why you're giving that illustration in this transition statement. Because what we're talking about in this lesson is actions. That we all have actions in our lives that are not in keeping with the life that we desire to live. As followers of Jesus, there are certain desires and outcomes that we have in our lives, but there are certain actions that aren't in keeping with that. And the bottom line is we just have to admit it. We have to admit that if we have actions that are not in keeping with the desired outcome of our lives, and there's a problem somewhere, and that problem really needs to be addressed. So at this point, really what you're trying to do with your group is getting them to acknowledge, look, I do need to do something about this or that, and people should kind of know their own problems and their own sinful attitudes or behaviors or actions that need to be dealt with. What you're trying to do at this point is just saying, look, let's all face it. Let's all face it. There are some actions in our lives that really we need to address, and we need to figure out how that's going to change and get corrected, or we're going to end up in the wrong place in life, because our actions really determine our destination, okay? So that's what you're doing there on page 2 and giving this opening illustration. Now that leads you to page 3. On your transcript, this is where you start teaching your text, which is going to be, as you'll see, out of Proverbs 6. This is part of our Songs and Sayings sermon series that we're going through. Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs 6 is going to complement what you're going to hear in the worship center during the sermon, which will come from Proverbs 7. So this is a complementary lesson, as we always do. There's some introductory information there that you can provide, some background information on Proverbs chapter 6. You'll see there in your teaching transcript. And basically it's telling you this, that there's a clump of proverbs that go together that really warn us about sin and sinful behavior. Proverbs chapter 6 is part of that cluster, that clump, but in fact, Proverbs 6 is the lead into it. It's the first part of that section of Proverbs that warn us about sin. You can share that with your group if you find that to be relevant. That's going to lead you to Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 through 19. So at this point, you have your text read out loud. You can designate someone to do it, or you can read it yourself. I know when I'm teaching a small group setting, I like to have somebody else read the verses, which gives me a chance to look at my notes a little bit and see where I got to go from there. All right, so designate somebody to read those verses, and after you do that, you need to stick with me and hang with me right here, okay? After these verses are read, you are going to teach your group about Hebrew poetry and about how it's written. So in order to teach that, you're probably going to have to learn it right here with me, all right? Now, let me kind of teach you what you're going to teach them. You know, in our way of telling stories or writing down things that we want to communicate to people, sometimes we like to make lists, right? Think of maybe a top 10 list. You know, those of you who watch David Letterman, every now and then he'll do a top 10 list, right? Or those of you who like to watch SportsCenter, every week they'll do the plays of the week. You've got your top 10 plays of the day or the plays of the week, right? On those top 10 lists, there's always kind of a highlight reel, a highlight point, or a highlight reel there, play that's kind of the best one. On our list, when we do a top 10 list, when does that highlight play show up? I mean, when is the one that you really want everybody to remember? When do we make that one? We save it for last, right? We go number 10, number 9, number 8, and now number 1, boom. That's the one that we really want to emphasize. That's the emphatic part of our list. All right, the Hebrews, they did lists as well, and in their list there was a highlight point and an emphatic point. But here's the thing. There was a form of poetry that they used and a form of list making that they used, but the emphatic point was not at the end. It was somewhere else. You're going to teach this to your group. And the reason you're going to teach it is because what you just read in Proverbs 6 utilizes this form of literature. It's called a chiasm, all right? Now, a chiasm was just a form of what was known as parallelism. The Hebrews had a form of literature called parallelism. A chiasm was a form of that. Now, what you're going to do on page 3, you're going to set all of that up. You're going to explain what I just did, that the Hebrews had a form of list making, and that there was an emphatic part of the list. You're going to set all of that up. Now on page 4 in your transcript, you're going to explain how it worked, all right? What you're going to teach is something called a chiasm. And here's the best way to illustrate it that I can think of, and it's explained this way on your transcript. Think of it like a sandwich, all right? Think of a sandwich. For example, a cheeseburger. You're going to make a cheeseburger. What do you start with? You start with a bun. Actually, you start with a pair, right? 2 buns right here. They're going to parallel one another. On each bun, what are you going to do? You're going to put some garnishing or some condiment. So you've got this bun and this bun. Now you're going to put something on this one, maybe some mayo or some mustard. And then on this one, you're going to put something, maybe some lettuce or some pickles. So you've got the buns which parallel one another. You've got the condiments which parallel one another. Then what do you have? Then you've got the essence of the sandwich, the meat and the cheese. That's why it's called a cheeseburger, because the cheeseburger is not really about the bun and the condiments as much as it is about the meat and the cheese. So think of that whole process where we just worked toward the middle. Lay that thing on its side. Think of like a mountain laid on its side. Everything is working toward the middle, right? That's the emphatic part of that sandwich. Okay, that's like a Hebrew chiasm. Instead of thinking of two buns, think of two statements. And instead of thinking of two condiments, think of two more statements. And now think of a statement that shows up at the end or in the middle. That is a Hebrew chiasm. And the emphatic part of this poem or of this proverb or whatever's written in a chiasm kind of a way, the emphasis, the highlight, the main point, the big zinger is the middle part. That middle of the mountain, all right? That's the part that's an emphasis. So as you teach through all of this, you're going to teach pretty much what I just taught. Your point that you're making is this. In this parallelism, this Hebrew parallelism called a chiasm, it's all about the middle. In fact, I would have everybody repeat that. Say this with me. It's all about the middle. The middle of the poem or the middle of the proverb, the middle of the saying. That's the part that the one telling the proverb is trying to get everybody to notice. Now, why do we take all of the time to explain this whole process? Here's why. What you just read in Proverbs chapter 6 is a chiasm. It's a chiasm. So on page 4 of your transcript, it's teaching you how to teach everything that I just taught you about the fact that it's all about the middle. It's like a cheeseburger. You know, that's what a chiasm is. It's a statement that works toward the middle. It's a top 10 list, or in this case of our proverb, it's a top 7 list. But the big punch isn't number 7, it's actually number 4. All right? Now, you're not going to say that just yet, but you're leading everybody to it. Look at page 5 on your teaching transcript. At this point, here's what you want to do. Now that you've taught the concept of the Hebrew chiasm, what you want to do now is have everybody look back at Proverbs chapter 6, 16 through 19, and try and piece together the parts. You're going to say, okay, we've got 7 things here, 7. Which of them go together? And you're going to try and get everybody now to pair them up. Now, here's some obvious parallels that everybody should notice. And again, you'll probably have to lead everybody there because, man, they're going to be hearing this for the first time, this whole chiasm thing. What parts of this list of 7 things, which of them pair together? Which of them parallel? Well, there's some that are easy to kind of find here. For example, the Proverbs mention a lying tongue and a false witness. Okay, those kind of go together. That's kind of like either 2 buns or 2 sets of condiments. Those parallel one another. What else goes together in this proverb? Well, you'll notice that he mentions feet and hands. Okay, feet and hands. Those parallel one another. So again, there's another stack that parallels one another on this whole thing that's building toward a middle piece. What else parallels? Well, there's one that's a little harder to notice that your group may need you to point out. It's the first thing on the list, the haughty eyes, and the last thing on the list, which is the person who stirs up conflict. Those don't necessarily seem like parallels for me and for you, but they are, because in the Hebrew tongue, the haughty eyes, that's just an expression. That's kind of a catchphrase that talks about somebody that looks out for themselves, somebody with selfish motives. Well, that one's paired up in this proverb with the person who's stirring up conflict in the community because of selfish reasons. So think about it. You've got the haughty eyes and the one stirring up conflict. They're the buns of the sandwich. Then you've got the lying tongue and the false witness. Okay, now we put some mustard and some mayo on this thing. What else do we have? Oh, hands and feet. There's another parallel. We got our lettuce and we got our pickles. You know what that leaves? One thing. There's one thing that's not paired up with something else, and it just happens to be found where? In the middle. You've got a list of 7 things. 1 goes with 7. 2 goes with 5. 3 goes 2 goes with 6, 3 goes with 5. What does that leave? Number 4, right in the middle. Guess what that is? A heart that plots evil. So here's the point. Here's the point. Don't miss it. This proverb is a chiasm. It's a top 7 list. But the top part of the list, it's the mountain peak. It's number 4 on the list. A heart that stirs evil. So here's your whole point in this. Here's the whole point. This Proverbs, it's really not about 7 things. It's about one thing, the heart. This is where Proverbs 6, 16 through 19 is pointing us, toward the heart. So the point is this. Are you stirring up trouble with people? Are you going places you shouldn't be going? Are you doing things you shouldn't be doing? Are you in conflict with people that you really shouldn't be? You know why that is? It's because of a heart problem. It's because of a rotten heart. That's where all of this is leading. So at this point, you've taught this whole structure of Hebrew thinking. Now you're showing how Proverbs chapter 6 uses that structure, and that it's all about the heart. Now at this point in your lesson, and don't do it until this point, at this point you'll pass out this handout that describes this whole cluster of verses that you're looking at and how it's all pointing to a heart that plots evil. Don't hand this out at the beginning of the lesson. Don't hand it out before you get to this part of the lesson, because if you do, people aren't going to listen to you. They're going to read a chart that makes no sense to them. They're going to miss the whole point. So after you've taught all of this, you'll see on page 5 in your transcript, it says, now distribute this chart. That's when you need to do it. So at this point, everybody should be able to see that what Proverbs chapter 6, 16 through 19 is teaching us is this. It's the heart. It's the heart that determines our actions. So think about this in context of what we're teaching. Hopefully we've put down some pride and realize that there are some actions in our lives that need to change and to be different. What we've just learned is this. If those actions are going to be made right, our heart's going to have to be made right. Our heart's going to have to be made right. This is what this is all about. Now, move on through your teaching transcript. Once you've made all of this point, and I hope this has been clear to you. You may have to go back and watch all of this part again. But after you've made that point, you'll notice the rest of page 5, you've got several verses that you're going to have people read. These are all verses about the heart, and these are all verses that illustrate that our hearts, they're rotten. That our hearts are inclined to go the wrong way. So think about this. What we're saying is this, that our hearts determine our actions, but our hearts go the wrong way, just naturally. They're inclined towards sin. So, page 6 on your transcript. We're bringing this kind of to a close now. Here's our $1 million question. Here's a $1 million question. Look at it. How do you change your heart? Or better yet, can you change your heart? If the heart determines our actions, and our actions determine really where we end up in life, can we change our heart? Can we make it right? The answer is, and you'll see this in your teaching transcript, no. We cannot change our hearts. They are marred by sin and blackened by sin, and we cannot clean sin up. That's bad news, but there is hope. It says so in your transcript. There's hope because God gives us a promise that He Himself will change our hearts and fix our hearts. You've got some passages that you can read there to your group. Read those. It's a promise of God that He takes a bad heart and makes it right. That He takes a heart that's inclined toward evil and redirects it and really rebirths it is what He does. He gives us a new heart, all right? So now we've got a heart that can go the right way, which is wonderful news. Now, having said that, the bottom of page 6 on your transcript, you've got a big quote that you'll read from a book called The Pursuit of Holiness. You're going to read that, that paragraph there that highlights that part of the book. And basically what that's telling us is that kind of like a farmer, God sends the rain and God does all of this, but a farmer has some work to do. So this is where you're leading, and this is the end of your teaching transcript here. And by the way, when you get to the bottom of page 6 here, you don't want to analyze this too much or discuss it too much or delve into it too much, because once you hit the end of page 6, what you're doing is you're prepping everybody for their group discussion time. All right, so look at the bottom of page 6 where you tell that quote from the Pursuit of Holiness. That leads you into page 7, where you're going to ask some questions, which you're basically saying, okay, so let's start thinking about this. And here are the questions that you'll see on page 7. Understanding that only God can change our heart, what are some practical things that we can do to make sure that our hearts stay on the right course? Those are the kind of questions you're asking. And again, you're just prepping them now for a group discussion time. So let me kind of highlight where we've been so far. Let me just kind of highlight it all. Here's where we've been. Our actions matter. Our actions, more than our intentions, are going to determine where we end up in life. They matter. Our actions are determined by our heart. It's the heart that is the heart of the matter as it relates to our actions. However, our hearts are inclined toward evil. They are bent the wrong way. But God promises to give us a new heart, a clean heart. But we have some work to do. We have to overcome the flesh that, would call out to us and lead our hearts in the wrong direction. So now the question is, what do we do? On our end, what's our responsibility to make sure that we take the kind of actions in keeping with a new heart? That's where you've led everybody. That leads you to page 8 on your teaching transcript, which is that application moment. Application moment on page 8. You should know the ropes by now. The application moment is when you break your group into even smaller groups of 3, 4, 5 people. If your group is big enough to do that, you break them into smaller clusters. You provide them with their group handout and let them work through it. If you want to see the group handout, look at page 10 on your teaching transcript. Look at that. Page 10 on your teaching transcript is the group handout that's going to be in your folder on Sunday morning. At this point in your lesson, you distribute those. You've got everybody in clusters. You just let them work through that. It really doesn't need any explanation. There are 2 parts to this one this week. The top part is where you finished your lesson with the Pursuit of Holiness illustration and those prep questions. At this point, everybody's going to talk through them and work through them themselves. After that, they've got a proverb that they're going to read, Proverbs 4. It's got some selected verses there, and they're going to be looking for some things in that proverb that they're going to talk about together. So really at this point, all you have to do is put them in those groups, give them the handout, and keep them on time, kind of coach them through time and say, all right, 5 more minutes, let's wrap it up, that kind of thing, all right? After everybody has done all of that, pretty much the lesson is over. All you have to do is conclude it. So if you look at page 9 on your teaching transcript, you'll see a conclusion. It's really simple. It comes back to the Emperor's New Clothes, ties everything together, finishes with the memory verse of the week, which is Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, Proverbs 4:23, which talks about how above all else we have to guard our hearts because it's the wellspring of life, which at this point in the lesson, your groups and clusters should have talked about the things that we do to guard our hearts. And by the way, you should notice also now on the back of that handout that you distribute as part of those application moments, that on your handout, now you'll notice on the back of your handout, there's some work for your group to do throughout the week. Part of that work points back to this lesson that you just taught and back to the sermon that they heard. But part of that, handout leads them toward the next lesson, does some prep work. So be sure to explain that to your group if they haven't noticed it yet, but that's a new thing that we've got for them that helps them stick with this lesson and get ready for the next one, all right? Well, I hope this coaching video has been good for you. I hope it explains some things that maybe weren't self-explanatory as you read through your lesson. I hope you have a good time teaching through the chiasm stuff, because what you're doing in doing that, really, you're not just teaching this lesson, you're teaching them how to read the Bible now and how to discover the main point of passages within the Bible. So I hope that you learned something here. I hope they learned something here. But above all, I hope all of this learning moves beyond our head and down into our hearts, because that's where it really matters, right? Hey, God bless you. Have a great small group time Sunday morning. We'll see you then.